Room. So I'm really grateful to Peter and that chance encounter because it's the reason I've been able to come over to Perth and be here. So a bit about myself. I'm a research fellow at University of Oxford. I'm situated in the Environmental Change Institute and Oxford Net Zero. And Oxford Net Zero is an institute set up by Miles and two other directors, Sam Funkhauser and Steve Smith. And it's about, how do we get to net zero? And importantly, how do we actually bring together all of the people at Oxford across different departments together and working on net zero strategies? And so we do it's all good. And so we do research, academic research, we do engagement, and we do communication as well. So we try and do the whole package rather than just keeping in a silo and keeping things to ourselves. And so that's the little round logo you can see there, Net Zero. And I was really fortunate to meet Miles and come onto this team. So my background was in climate ethics and public policy. I finished my PhD at Oxford last year. I was doing, again, climate ethics and policy, split between those two faculties. And now I've joined the team as a research fellow, really working on carbon management. And my official title is research fellow on net zero for the fossil fuel sector. So to pick up on Peter's point, everyone goes, what? You're doing what for fossil fuels? So essentially we are looking at their net zero strategies and seeing if a proper credible one exists yet. Haven't seen one yet. And then importantly, we're with the team, I work with the physicists and Miles, we're looking at, well, what would a net zero strategy for them have to look like? What are they going to have to do to actually get us all to net zero? And so as a segue into this talk, the last 6 months I've been working on EU policy, which as an Australian, I didn't have much familiarity with the EU, but now kind of not as good as the back of my hand, but getting there. And they've got a really interesting development that's come out in the form of the Net Zero Industry Act. And so I'm going to be talking about that and see where we go. I'll try and, we're starting a bit late, but this will be about 25, 30 minutes, and then hopefully we can have a good discussion. So, is the European Net Zero Industry Act a game changer? And what does it mean for carbon management in Australia? And of course, we were having a conversation about this in the room just before over coffee, but it's very important to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land here, and I believe we're on the Whadjuk Noongar Nation. And so, of course, I want to pay my respects, past, present, emerging, but also to any Aboriginal Torres Strait Island people here today and across the land. That's me, so I won't say any more about that because you'll be very bored. But this is my boss, Miles Allen, to put a picture to the face. He's served as he's currently the head of atmospheric, oceanic and planetary physics at Oxford, but also is the lead author of the IPCC Special Report on 1.5 and some other work going on at Oxford as well, including new work on how do you have net zero aligned offsetting, which is a bit of a big topic. And so this went down very well at the conference, and I'm very apologetic that I forgot my prop, which was lent to me by Miles. It's his favourite way of starting a talk. And it was a piece of coal. Right? So get up there and people think, oh, God, where's she going with this? But it's a really good representation because it represents each piece, let's say, imagine, 500 billion tonnes of fossil carbon. And that's coal, oil, gas, and limestone. It's really important to look at this as geological sources of carbon, and that's why the visualization of the coal helps. And for each 500 billion tonnes of fossil fuel carbon that contains, that's the equivalent, when it's burnt, of 2 trillion tonnes of carbon dioxide, CO2. And when that's burnt, that gives us 1 degree of warming, approximately. And so if we look at all the known reserves of fossil fuels and fossil carbon in Earth, there's enough approximately for 6 degrees warming. And so I want you to just to visualize where this talk is going and why it's important. Right? I want to look at how much have we used. And we've used 1 degree so far, and we kind of found that out at about the end of the 2000s, 2009. And that discovery or realization that we've reached 1 degree of warming took us about 250 years. From the very start of our first use of fossil fuels, start of the Industrial Revolution, up until now. And then in just 15 years' time, so on from the late 2000s, we've already burnt through 1/3 of the next chunk. And so we've set 2050 as our target, and 1.5, we want to limit it to 1.5 degrees warming. That's in just 25 years. And so this really puts it into perspective. And even more so when we think, I don't know if the people online can see this properly.
Got it on my screen.
Oh, good.
So they're seeing it.
When you look at the total increase in energy-related CO2 emissions, you can see from the late 2000s, and also even from 2022, they've just gone up. And so we are speeding towards this. And so it leads us to the question, and what I'm going to talk today, is how are we going to deal with that? So there's going to be 3 sections. I want to talk to you about something you might not have heard called geological net zero, and then walk you through what are some of the international policy developments happening in regards to that, and what can we draw out the lessons might be for Australia. So geological net zero, this is Miles's concept. It's a bit of a mouthful, so sometimes I like to say just geo zero. And I think a good introduction to it is to show you what you might already be familiar with. So this is what we see a lot, graphs showing emissions reductions. Right? We're here, we need to reduce emissions and try to get to net zero by 2050 or mid-century and down to net zero here. What you're also probably really used to seeing is, just to say, these are the trajectories coming out of the IPCC. What you're also probably used to seeing is emission reductions coupled with emission removals. So, and I've just put 2050 there as the reference, just to keep some consistency. So we need to reduce, and then to get to net zero, we need to remove after. But what I kind of want to really get you thinking about is when we reduce, and 2050 is about here, what's going on under here? This is what we don't actually see mapped out very much to Miles's chagrin. So this is where I want to introduce you to geological net zero. So geological CO2 production is in red. This is the amount of CO2, geological CO2 that we produce. And that's, again, coal, oil, gas, and limestone. And to get to net zero, we need to bring it down. Right, that's the red line there. That's emissions coming down. This is net zero. But then geological CO2 storage is in blue. And we also need to increase the amount that we store. And actually, that has a similar progression. And this is all based on the technology neutral IPCC pathway that tries to keep, the technology we rely on neutral. And the way we get to geological storage, you can get there through carbon capture and storage, point source, that will help reduce emissions. And as we saw in the last graph, you can get BECCS and DACs, remove it from the atmosphere and store it. And all of that relies on about the same value chain, which uses capture, transport, and storage.
Should you just explain DACs and BECCS? Some people may not
DACs
know
and BECCS.
just briefly,
yep.
what they stand for at least.
Yes, no, that's a very good point. So carbon capture, essentially, you might be more familiar with. That's when you are letting emissions vent into the atmosphere, and this is from natural gas production. It can also be from cement, steel production, etc., and you just prevent those emissions going into the atmosphere, so you capture them at source. It's essentially a form of pollution control. So instead of allowing that to go into the atmosphere, you're capturing it, putting it underground. And the distinction with BECCS and DACs comes from the fact that they're about, well, once the emissions are up in the atmosphere, we need to remove them and put them back underground. And so BECCS is when you do that with bioenergy, and often that can be organic matter that you produce and then burn and capture and put underground, using that same value chain, the transport and storage. And the DACs is direct air capture. So actually just removing it from the atmosphere and putting it underground. Very difficult, very expensive, but it's already being done in America, so there are cases going on. And so this point here, I think, is really important. And this point is geological net zero. And that is essentially when production reduces and storage increases so that we get to geological net zero. And to do that, we need to go from having, as we do now, about 0.1% of our CO2 geologically stored to 100% of all the production that is still going on to being geologically stored. And I think I don't have this up there, but I think this is important to stress, right? You might say, well, why do we have to store all of this CO2 underground, right? Why can't we use nature-based solutions to store this? Because there's a lot of good projects going on. And it really comes down to permanence. The CO2 from these geological sources need to be stored because of their dense cumulative impact underground, or at least in geological timeframes, thousands of years. And when you store that on the land, on nature, that's a great pressure, but also that you get the risk of re-release and the risk of management. And also there's a lot of emissions to cover that are arising from land use as well. And so we tend to say, if you have keep it at the same source and the same sink. So geological source, geological sink, biological, biogenic source, biological sink. And so how do we get there? Produce less, store more. The point here is that we really need to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming before the world stops using fossil fuels. That's the main point. Why is it necessary? Because in the IPCC scenarios, we're still using fossil fuels long before we reach net zero. And so if we want to meet the targets, we're going to have to store the rest. And that's true even if we drastically reduce emissions, because look, that's a drastic reduction of production. And it's true even if we electrify the grid, right? Because there are uses of fossil fuels beyond power generation and heat generation. And I'm talking about steel, cement, chemicals. And so in terms of what we need to prioritize in our strategies, we can look at reducing emissions and reducing levels of productions. That's a lot of work to do, right? So it's really important that we focus on reducing emissions and electrifying the grid and reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. But this is also a pretty big chunk. And this is an industry we have to, rather than an industry we have to shrink, this is an industry, geological storage, that we have to grow from almost nothing. So the majority of the focus should be on reductions, but scaling is also a big priority. And there's nature restoration, but we can come back to that. That's also very important. And compare that depiction of effort that I just visualized with the amount that we're investing in the energy transition by sector. These investments circled here are investments relevant to reducing CO2 production, right? So reducing our need. And it's in renewable energy, electrified transport, electrified heat. It's really gone up, right? But then when you look at the proportion that's been invested in activities that would increase geological production, hydrogen CCS, you can't even see them. They're not there. Not even if you zoom in, and I've really zoomed in on that. And so when you think about, well, how should we prioritize and share our efforts into getting to net zero? Yes, a lot should be towards reducing, but then we've got to bring up the amount that we're investing in doing about geological storage. So that's the need for it. And the big question, what I want to spend the next 10, 15 minutes on, is how do we fund it? Right? And so I like to think, this is an oversimplification, absolutely, but I like to think that there are two kinds of money only: private money and public money. And so I like to think that there are two kinds of policy: market mechanism and subsidy or public funding. They kind of represent that distinction between private money and public money. And so which one will help us build capacity for geological storage? And this is where we've really seen the debate for CCS play out between this give and take between these two policy strategies. If you look at using private money, we've tried to rely on carbon pricing and get the market going and get it to build this up. But it's been really, really ineffective. It hasn't really supported the development of large-scale, long-term, capital-intensive investments. Right? It is really good at kind of going to the short term. What's the most economic? Let's get that going. But it doesn't capture that long-term investment, and that's what geological storage needs. And this isn't new, right? We've known that it's been an ineffective policy mechanism for building geological storage for some time. And it was internationally recognized with the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition that we would need more than carbon pricing to reach the net zero targets of the Paris Agreement. Okay, what about the other one? Public money. Well, a big international development recently has been the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and the introduction or update of the 45Q tax credit. We saw high credit values placed on those who wanted to engage in building up geological storage, either through capture, right, at source, or direct air capture, which I spoke about before. There's a whole lot of mechanisms worked into there to make this really flexible and work really well. So you can directly claim those tax benefits even if you don't have lots of tax implications left. So you don't need to worry about kind of where you sit in the tax bracket. They also extended the timelines. So this goes up right for an extension of 7 years up into the 2030s. And has it worked? Well, this is 2024. This is the US. No, sorry, I think this is global.
World. Yeah.
World, this is world, sorry, I thought so. So this is the world capacity. In 2024, the International Energy IEA suggests that we're at about 25 million tonnes per year of geological storage is operational. And when you skip to 2030, the green, so the blue is operational, that's based on what we have now. The green is planned. And you can see there's been a huge jump. Globally, 136 million tonnes is planned by 2030. And I think a lot of that has been as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so the world is kind of waking up to this. And you can see as well the trends have changed. There's been a lot more policy support based on, sometimes you hear it referred to as CCUS, that U stands for utilization, but for CCS. And, importantly, while this is not global investment, this is global deployment of technology, which of course is influenced by investment, you can actually see that finally, at least CCUS is making it. It's a very thin line, it's finally on the board. Hydrogen is still, I think it's the tiniest line up here. You can't even see it. But it's starting to change. And so in terms of which one will build capacity, it seems that the Inflation Reduction Act and using public money and public funding and subsidy has been successful. It's the same thing we've been doing for ages, but it's taken it to a brand new level. Right? And we're seeing that debate reach Australia in terms of the subsidy wars. Companies here are wanting Australia to go the same way, and they don't think the Australia response to the Inflation Reduction Act goes far enough. There are, of course, downsides. It's not a finite resource. It's subject to political change and public acceptance. You know, suddenly, taxpayers are on the line for this, and a lot of people are pushing back against CCS and don't want it. So there's problems. You might get a change of government, so the subsidy might get pulled. That would also be damaging for long-term investments. And so the research I've been doing in the past 6 months has led us to think, well, maybe there's a third solution, and that there might be a bit of a, rather than playing the same game and just taking it to a new level, there might be actually a game changer. And that is in the form of the Net Zero Industry Act, introduced in Europe, and specifically under Article 18 that it introduces. This was the project I was involved in, and this was a 4-year-long project from the EU Horizon project, quantifying and deploying responsible negative emissions. This is on removals, but I was looking at CCS in it, given the impact that would have on the CCS value chain and how it could play into that direct air capture and bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. But it's relevant for the whole CCS value chain. So very quickly, I'll just run over this. The EU Net Zero Industry Act entered into force 29 June 2024. The focus there was on building up strategic net zero technologies that the EU had identified. Wind, batteries, grid technologies, heat pumps, right? But also carbon capture and storage, identified as a key net zero technology. And so why did they introduce the Net Zero Industry Act? Or what does it do? It's a form of regulation that is meant to provide a secure and sustainable supply to those technologies for Europe. It cuts red tape, it fast-tracks these projects, and it tries to eliminate regulatory burdens that would prevent those technologies from developing. It's coupled with these ambitious targets. EU wants to provide 15% of the global market share of those technologies by 2050. That's really big. And really at the very, very heart of this is pressure from Russia and the Ukraine on their fuel supply and energy security, pressure from China, who has absolutely taken the global market for renewables and critical minerals by storm, and pressure from the US, who are speeding ahead on a subsidy-based model that the EU couldn't support in terms of doing subsidies, especially because of their setup with the single market and different nation states. So the Europe is feeling a bit under pressure and need a viable way to respond to this without the subsidy model. They also have the ETS in Europe, and it hasn't been working in terms of providing that motivation to build up geological storage. So they introduced a chapter on storage injection capacity. And these are all the acts that relate to it, but I think just for our purposes, the only one that's important to look at here is Article 18. And that essentially introduces an obligation on oil and gas producers within the territory of the Union to provide storage CO2 injection capacity, so the infrastructure and ability to inject CO2 underground by 2030. And the EU has set a target of 50 million tonnes of injection capacity by 2030. And so all the oil and gas producers within the territory must contribute to that target being met. It's an obligation. It's a new kind of actually mandate policy. And it's really actually very significant because it's the first legislated climate-focused fossil fuel sector mandate. What does that mean? It's the first climate mandate put on a wide group of oil and gas producers. That's really significant. It's the first to introduce penalties into that on non-compliance, which are meant to come into effect next year. They're still being developed, but they're meant to be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. And they've, rather than looked at a storage obligation, so oil and gas producers must store, they've actually provided an obligation to provide injection capacity. And that's pretty neat, because that means that it's about building up the value chain, right? And that value chain can be used not just by the oil and gas sector, but for steel, cement, other uses, direct air capture. And so it really introduces that flexibility, and the key thing is about getting that geological storage potential built up. And why now? It's because they realized that the public money wasn't working, the subsidy wouldn't fit with the EU model, but also the private model mechanism looking at ETS hasn't been working, and it was explicitly flagged as a failure in the Net Zero Industry Act that they're responding to. It doesn't have the capacity to work as it is at the moment, and they're hoping that this Article 18 can work with it and help get everything back on track. So it's only temporary up until 2030. So I'll just skip over that because I want to really, in the last few minutes, get to the lessons for Australia. So what can we learn, right? And I think everyone was a bit shocked when I gave this presentation a few days ago, because I said nothing, right? And the reason I say this is because Australia, I think, actually has a lot to teach the world about mandates, and that we've actually done something very similar to this before. And so rather than us learning from the Net Zero Industry Act, I think that we've got examples in our own country here. And not about carbon capture and storage and geological storage, but about, for example, the renewable energy target. This was a mandate policy, the same way as Article 18 is a mandate policy on CCS. This was on renewable energy. It worked alongside market mechanisms. So the renewable energy target creates a market to incentivize the generation of renewable energy. But that doesn't mean it was just a market mechanism, because it essentially, the key point is that the liable entities must purchase a certain percentage of their electricity from renewable sources each year. That's an obligation, right? That's a mandate. And it was actually, when it was first introduced in 2001, called the Mandatory Renewable Energy Target. And I want to know, did it work? Well, these are the renewable energy targets as they increased. The targets in the RPP, which is renewable power percentage. And then this is, from the IEA, the evolution of total energy supply in Australia, just looking at wind, solar, etc. And it seemed to work, right? Follows that upward trajectory. That's really nice. And I think that obligation has a lot to do with it. Something closer to home is the WA domestic gas policy. This required LNG exporters in Western Australia to reserve 15% of their domestic gas supply to domestic markets, right? That was seen as necessary to ensure WA's gas requirements domestically, and seen as a safeguard for energy security. And whether or not it worked, you would all know much better than I would in this area, but as someone coming from the East Coast, we're very jealous of this. Our gas prices really spiked during the fuel crisis, whereas Western Australia dealt with that really well. And again, this was a mandate policy. And so, I'll just finish on this slide. Could a similar mandate policy help get Australia really going on CCS? That's the kind of pitch I want to present to you. So, thank you.
Good. Perfect. Now, I'm going to stop sharing this so I can see everybody. Thank you, Alice. I'm going to ask if anyone online has a question. I will monitor, but anyone in the room have a question for Alice as well, and then we can go from there. Oh yes, Petra does. So now I'm going to see how do we do this.